Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just one moment. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, you're
Okay,
fine.
thank you very much. Okay, just checking, making sure the connection is fine. We are also recording this. So again, good morning to you all. Someone's asking whether there's class today. There is class every Monday for this whole term at this hour. Your instructor should have made this absolutely clear to you, and possibly they did. And please check your email regularly. Please check Blackboard regularly. But I'll repeat this for your benefit. Even though today is a legal holiday, I am delivering the lectures as planned, because we have a very complicated logistic plan this term, as you've understood, and I don't want to disrupt it further by postponing the Monday morning lecture and then interfering with the breakout lectures and so forth. It's very important that this is the start of each week, and you are fully entitled to be on holiday today if you prefer to be. And that's going to apply to the hundreds of people who will be watching this recording. But to those of you who are here with me this morning, you're more than welcome. And I hope you're enjoying the Labor Day weekend in any case. But just for the record, I'll be lecturing every Monday at this time, as far as I'm able to at least. And these, once again, these Monday morning plenary lectures will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. I see that hundreds of you both present and asynchronously have watched it, so that's fine, and we'll continue with this plan, okay? So I want to give you a roadmap where we're headed today. Last week we covered Descartes and introduced rationalism, and also what fell out of Descartes' epistemology and his inquiries about existence. We got to his substance dualism, and I'm sure that was further clarified. I know it was further clarified in the Thursday lecture to my group, and hopefully it was also further elucidated by your own talented instructors during your breakout sessions later in the week. So that was an introduction to philosophy of mind, philosophy of existence, philosophy of knowledge. And we're going to continue this plan. I want to share a screen with you momentarily to show you a kind of roadmap of where we're going today. And we're going to look at a very different philosopher from Descartes. We'll look at George Barkley, who came after Descartes. He's an empiricist, unlike Descartes, who is an exemplary rationalist in that tradition, yes. That knowledge is a product of our reasoning minds. Barkley is an exponent, and a very famous one, of the British empiricist tradition, which takes a very different stance. And in Barkley's case, our knowledge is going to be based entirely on perception, at least to begin with, and moreover for Barkley, existence is going to be based entirely on perception and not on a reasoning mind. So we will see that there are some similarities with Descartes a little bit further down the road, but that he is very divergent from the beginning about the notion of existence. And we'll have a look at that too. If you understand what Barkley is trying to tell us about the nature of existence and what we generally think of as the physical world outside of mind, many of you may be comfortable with that idea. But if you're able to digest Barkley's argument, it's very radical and very shocking, because he's going to tell us something about reality which is probably contrary to much of your habitual thinking and perhaps your common sense. But here we go. Let me try and share a screen with you first, so that we can have a look at this roadmap, all right? And this will apply, this roadmap will apply not only to today, but also to next week when we look at a different philosopher, Churchland. Okay, so we started talking about basic ontologies, ontology being the philosophy of being or existence. And I just want to run through a few possibilities with you. As you see Descartes as a dualist, but that means two kinds of things. Yes, we could start at the beginning and suppose with some difficulty that there are no kinds of things, that there's nothing at all. This is not a very easy position to defend, right? If you're a nihilist, then you're basically denying that anything exists. I don't know too many ontological nihilists. There are moral nihilists, there are different kinds of nihilists, but as far as ontology is concerned, I'm pretty sure that there is something rather than nothing, and perhaps you share this view, yes? It would be very difficult for us to sit around assuming that there is nothing at all in the world. Then we'd have to account for why we're sitting here having that conversation. Even if it's a hallucination, as Descartes might suppose, that's still not nothing, right? So anyway, you could be a nihilist. And there are some very esoteric and interesting defenses of nihilism. I'm not going to spend time on them, but Nagarjuna, who's sometimes called the second Buddha, proposed a very interesting ontology. That's quite an advanced topic, and we covered in my Buddhism elective. And he argued that phenomena are in fact empty of the thing we call existence. Interesting argument that he makes. There's a contemporary philosopher named Jason Turner who's written about ontological nihilism. And the challenge really is for us not to be nihilists, but if we're rather going to suppose that there's something instead of nothing, then we're going to have to try to identify what kinds of somethings there might be. And this is really what ontology is about. So if we begin with the simplest possible version and suppose there's only one kind of thing in the world, yes, that everything is made of one kind of thing, fundamentally, we could suppose that, or that, to say it a different way, that there is only one mode of being, that would be called monism, yes, just one kind of thing. And so we could defend that kind of ontology, and we're going to see two examples of it today, this week and next week. Barkley, pronounced Barkley, yes, spelled Berkeley like the campus in California, but it's his name in Britain is pronounced Barkley. He's an Irishman, but Barkley is the pronunciation. And Barkley is going to defend a very unusual kind of monism, namely idealism. Barkley is going to argue, and very, very cogently, I think, that actually everything is made of ideas, not stuff. And we'll come to him. More commonly, perhaps, and more easy to digest, especially in America, which is a materialistic culture, is this notion of materialistic monism, right? That this may be something you have all accepted without giving it a name. That is that the world is made of stuff. Yes, everything is made of some kind of stuff. And maybe all that stuff boils down to one fundamental kind of stuff. And if it does, then that's material monism. Okay, so those are two varieties of monism, and we're going to look at both of them. Barkley, the exemplar of the idealistic version, namely that there's only one kind of thing and it's actually non-material. And Churchland next week, who's an exponent and also a radical one, kind of radical materialism, that everything is made of matter, all right, and nothing else. So that's monism. Okay, dualism would be on this, ladder of ever increasing modalities of things. Dualism comes next. The proposition that there are two kinds of things in the world, or two modes of being. And we've already seen Descartes, who believes that there's a substance called mind, which is immaterial, and then there's also material stuff, but it's sort of less knowable to us, yes. But nonetheless, he is a dualist. And I want you to note that there are many kinds of dualisms. Descartes is not by any means the only dualist. There are lots of varieties, just like there are lots of flavors of ice cream. There are lots of varieties of dualism. One has all kinds of possibilities of property dualism and epiphenomenalism and interactionism. And I'm not going to trouble you with it, but there are many, many kinds. And we looked at Descartes as a great exemplar of substance dualism. An interesting side note, though, something else to think about, not for the sake of confusing you, but hopefully for the sake of making you think even more deeply. It's hard to be a dualist. The reason being that if you're a dualist, you could say, one could argue that it's impossible to be a dualist, because if you're a dualist, you have a further challenge. And that challenge is to explain how these two different modes of interaction, these two different modes of being interact in the world. Yes, if there are two different kinds of things in the world, how do they possibly interact? Or maybe they don't. But Descartes, for example, would say that the brain and the mind certainly interact. If I will by the mental faculty to raise my arm, my body is able to do this somehow, right? You can will to do something and then your body hopefully responds and does it. So how is it possible if these are two different kinds, fundamentally different kinds of substances? So they're like oil and water, they can't mix, yeah? They're two different substances. How is it possible for the mind to influence the body? Or vice versa, how is it possible for the body to influence the mind? This would suggest that we really need a third thing. Yeah, so one way to resolve this question of how two different things interact would be to posit a third thing, but then you're not a dualist, you become a pluralist, right? Now, Descartes' a dualist, but he does posit, in fact, God as the arbiter of this interaction. So he's sometimes called an occasionalist. I'm just going to mention this to you, that Descartes said, well, the only way that we could have such perfect coordination between matter and mind every time we need it is if God is involved in the picture and is actually taking care of the coordination on every occasion where the mind tells the body to do something and the body does it. That could only be because God is looking after the interaction. So Descartes remains in this dualistic picture, but he actually calls upon God as the mediator between the two different kinds of substances. Okay, I know that sounds a bit strange, perhaps to some of you, or maybe not. If you look at Asia, if you look at Chinese philosophy, some of you may know about Taoism, where you have yin and yang, which is a fundamental duality, and we see everything coming in the world manifest in duals. And again, how do you reconcile these two? Well, they interact, and they're both coming from one thing. So Taoism is really monism. They're saying the Tao is the source of both yin and yang. So they're complements, and every complementary pair of things in the world has one source. So that's how they reconcile duality, by reverting to monism. You get the picture? So if your ontology is going to be consistent, you really will have to, whichever ontology you like, you will still have to answer the kinds of objections or problems that it will raise. All right. And lastly, pluralism is, of course, the notion that there are many kinds of things in the world, not none, not one, not two, but many, or many modes of being. And again, there's a plethora. It's kind of ironically true that there is a pluralism of pluralisms. There isn't one kind of pluralism. There are fittingly, perhaps, many kinds of pluralisms. And one of the most famous is from the ancient world, owing, I believe, to Empedocles, the ancient Greek, who asserted that the world was made of four basic elements. He called them fire, earth, air, and water. Some of you may have heard of this. It's still floating around out there, the idea that there were four kinds of fundamental things. It was a kind of a neat idea. Of course, it's false, but it was a neat and tidy package at the time, a pluralistic package, and it was very comprehensible to people, all right? Turns out, of course, it's much more complex than that, or perhaps simpler. Again, depending on your ontology. I'll take questions in a moment, but just to go back to the contrast now between Descartes and Barkley, if Descartes has a bumper sticker, probably it would say, I think, therefore I am. And as we've seen, that's a rationalist stance. If Barkley has a bumper sticker, it's going to say something very different ontologically. It's going to say to be is to be perceived. So in Barkley's picture, there could be no existence without perception. Very interesting. And we'll see how that plays out momentarily. All right, so that's our roadmap. We're going to look at Barkley this week and then Churchland next week. And that will play out the contrast between two kinds of monism versus Cartesian dualism. All right, so I'm going to stop this share. And before we go to Barkley himself and the text, are there any questions? I see a question on logistics from Ramon. Do we answer one or more of the suggested questions? Ramon, please pick one. Okay, read my lips. Don't answer all the essay questions. You have to write one essay on one question, okay? So you may choose any of the pre-approved questions, all right? And work on that. Okay, but please do not attempt to answer all of them. Only one. Okay? It's not a quiz, it's an essay. All right? Fair enough? Are we clear? Good? Okay, you're welcome. And is that what inspired Avatar, Fire, Earth, Air, Water? I don't know. Ahmed, are you referring to the movie or you're referring to something else? No answer. Oh, the series. Okay, I'm not aware of the series. Sorry. But in any case, that's still and the movie, was it inspired by pluralism? I don't think so. The movie was inspired by, I think, by very, very different ideas. But this business of fire, earth, air, water is still hanging around. It was a suggestion from antiquity, which still has some traction today. I think there was a band. Wasn't there a band called Earth, Wind, and Fire? Right? Earth, wind, and fire. I guess they forgot about the water. In any case, you don't have to lay awake at night losing sleep over ontology. Philosophers do this. But you can just sort of ask yourselves, well, what's my ontology? And it doesn't hurt to ask yourself what you think the world is made of, whether it's one thing or two things or many things. So we're going to further explore this now with Barkley. Any other questions? Okay, let's go to the text then. And Barkley, as you know, wrote these 3 dialogues, and the characters are Hylus and Philonus. Let me share the screen with you so that we can all look at this text together. Just bear with me. What happened to my share screen? There it is. Okay, I'm going to have to just go back and open that text, so hang on. Okay, we've got Barkley here, and now we'll be able to see it. It's not showing me what I want to see. It's still showing me this. Please bear with me because the thing's not behaving itself this morning. I have Barkley on my screen, and now I need to share it with you. There, that's better. Okay, George Barkley, 3 dialogues between Hylus and Philonus in opposition to skeptics and atheists. Now, I have to tell you that Barkley had an ulterior motive for writing this. It's not apparent or not obvious in the dialogues, but later I'll share with you, and your instructors will share with you, the ulterior motive. But meanwhile, he's in opposition to skeptics and atheists. And this began in the 18th century to emerge. He wrote this, I think, around 1711, obviously after Descartes. And there was, during that period of time, a shift in the world picture owing mostly to the Enlightenment, of which he was part, and the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, which began to unfold. So worldviews changed quite a bit, and people were becoming more skeptical about a lot of things. And as well, the possibility of atheism first arose around this time. So it was possible to question the existence of God, which hitherto had not been questioned in the West, not in any broad spectrum way. Okay, so Barkley writes these 3 dialogues between Hylus and Philonus. Hylus means matter. It's a Greek word for matter, or material substance, as he called it, right? So that's materialism. So Hylus will be the voice of believing in materialism. And Philonus means love of mind, philosophy, love of wisdom. These are Greek words, yeah? Philonus is a made-up word, but it means philo is love and nous is mind. So Philonus is love of mind. And Philonus will be the voice of Barkley in all of this, who's going to defend what may seem to you like a preposterous notion, namely that there is no material substance and everything is made only of ideas. And that's where Barkley's going. So we will then try to turn the page and see if we can have a look at this. It may be easier for me, actually, it will be easier for me if I can open the actual dialogue itself from my file, because that way I should be able to turn the page with you instead of flipping back and forth. So I'm going to try to do that and see if that will make it easier to share the screen. So please bear with me for 1 second while I open the original file as opposed to the one that I uploaded to your Google Drive folder. And hopefully that will make things easier. However, that said, I still need to locate it in the folder. There it is. All right, so hopefully now I'm going to share this with you, and then I'll be able to do a little bit of scrolling as we go. Okay, so we have the first dialogue. And Hylus says, and I'm going over the highlighted portions with you, and Hylus says they had a conversation the day before, and Hylus says, you were represented as someone who maintains the most extravagant opinion that ever entered into the mind of man, namely that there is no such thing as material substance in the world. And Philonus says, I seriously believe it. There's no such thing as what philosophers call material substance. But if I were made to see anything absurd or skeptical in this, I would have the same reason to renounce this belief as I think I now have to reject the contrary opinion. So he's maintaining an opinion which is certainly not popular or commonplace, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's extravagant. It's just his opinion, which happens to differ from most people's. So that's a kind of important point, I think. The idea is that your opinion may be different from someone else's, but that doesn't necessarily make it extravagant. All right. So just hang on a second and I'll flip the page. I want to go over this with you. So we'll come back to the share. This works a bit better. So Hylus says, what could be more fantastic or more in conflict with common sense or more obviously skeptical than to believe there's no such thing as matter? And Philonus says, hang on, what if it turned out that you who happen to believe there is matter are a greater skeptic? So this is just a conversation about what it means to be a skeptic, yes? To be a skeptic is not to deny what someone else affirms. Actually, that's just a difference of opinion. That's not skepticism. Okay, so Hylus backs off. Hold on a moment, Philonus. My definition of skeptic was wrong. Okay. I did say a skeptic is someone who doubts everything. Remember, Descartes did, right? That's a more classic idea of a skeptic. But I should have added, Hylus says, one who denies the reality and truth of things. And here we go again. What things? So Hylus says, okay, what do you think about distrusting the senses and denying the real existence of sensible things or claiming to know nothing of them? Isn't that enough to qualify a man as a skeptic? Now, I pause to point out the different meaning of the word sensible, which actually is, I think, a more pertinent meaning. Back in the 18th century, in English, the word sensible meant something that could be sensed. Okay, so please take note of that. When Hylus or Philonus uses the word sensible or the phrase sensible things, they mean things which can be sensed. And that's actually a more sensible meaning of sensible, right? Today we mean by sensible what? Someone want to say? If we say someone is sensible or something is sensible, what do we mean in contemporary speech? Anybody? Well, we mean that something makes sense, yes? Isn't that right? Oh, you're okay. I have to look at the chat. Hang on. You guys are challenging me this morning to open the chat room at the same time as everything else. There it is. Yes, agreeable with logic, makes sense, reasonable. That's correct. All of you who are saying this, David, Carlo, Hansa, Raji, yes. Anything that we call sensible today is all of those things. It's reasonable, it makes sense, it's agreeable with logic. Yeah, that's what we mean today. But if you think about the earlier meaning of sensible, it actually means something that can be sensed. It's more literal, right? So for example, by the word visible, we still mean something that can be seen, yes? And by the word audible, we still mean something that can be heard. So the word sensible is actually the umbrella term for all of the things that can be sensed. So if something is sensible in this dialogue, it means that it can be sensed by one of the five senses, okay? So just don't be confused by that earlier meaning, which in a way I think is a more appropriate meaning. So a sensible thing is something that can be sensed, okay? And Philonus says, well, let's see where it leads. He's denying the reality of sensible things. Basically, that's what Philonus is going to do. That the existence of things is not the right picture of the world. So let me flip the page, and then we'll start to get to the point of the dialogue, or rather, the actual direction of the dialogue. And I'm going to explain a little bit to you about where it's going, too, just so you can see the point of this and the strategy, actually, that Barkley's going to use in order to disabuse Hylus of this very notion. There is a strategy in place. So his strategy I'll explain very shortly. So Philonus says, what do you mean by sensible things? And Hylus says, well, things that are perceived by the senses. Can you imagine that I mean anything else? No, that's exactly what it means. And now an important question. And Philonus is taking him down this road for a very good reason. Are things perceived by the senses only the ones that are perceived immediately? Or do they include things that are perceived mediately, that is, through the intervention of something else? So please understand this distinction. I'm going to give you an illustration of what it means momentarily, and Philonus explains it. So we have two kinds of perception that we're distinguishing between. One is what is perceived immediately, and the other is what is perceived mediately. And there will be always a sequence. The first things we perceive are the immediate perceptions, and the second things that we perceive are the ones that follow, namely mediate, without the OIM in front. And what's the difference? Hylus doesn't understand. So Philonus explains, in reading a book, what I immediately perceive are the letters on the page. But mediately, or by means of these things, I may understand the words, whether the words on the page may be God, virtue, truth, or, whatever the words are on the page, these are suggested to my mind. But the first thing that the eye sees is not the words. The first thing the eye sees is actually the squiggles on the page, yes? Let me take a risk and share the whiteboard with you, if I can find that this morning. Isn't there a whiteboard in this? There's supposed to be a whiteboard in Zoom, is there not? Something I can write on? Whiteboard, there it is. Let's see if this works. So suppose, for example, that I'm going to type, all right? Suppose I type this, okay? So what do you immediately perceive? Anybody?
The letters.
You perceive somebody, I couldn't quite hear you. What did you say?
The letters.
You perceive the letters. Yes, you perceive a T-R-E-E, right? That's what your eye perceives, yes? Maybe not even that. Maybe your eye just perceives some blue squiggles on a white surface. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, you don't know the eye doesn't know that they're letters, right? Think about it clearly. The eye, in fact, is just sending information to through the retina and ultimately to the visual cortex in the brain, right? So we have a better picture of this, but Barkley's not incorrect. The eye only sees things; it doesn't make any discrimination, really. It doesn't make any judgments about what it's seeing. Yes, that's Barkley's point. Okay, suppose I were to draw, if I can find the pen, I would like to draw a squiggle on the board. I can't find. Yeah, here. If I were to, oh, it won't let me draw a squiggle. But if I were to draw a squiggle in a different language, some letter in a different language, for example, your eye would just see a squiggle. The fact that you are already able to read English means that your mind knows that that's a TREE and also knows that it's a word that stands for a tree. Yes, but the eye isn't doing any of that, right? The eye is only identifying some contrast on the page between some blue squiggles and the white page. You got it? You understand? That's very important. And that's what we mean by immediate perception. Suppose I write this word. Okay, so what's your immediate perception?
Nothing, like just the words, like
It's
just a bunch of random words.
It's just more squiggles on the page, yeah?
Yeah, just letters.
It's just letters, well, or blue squiggles, as you like. But your eye is simply conveying that information. Now, in the first case, you recognize that word, but that tree, but that's not your eye that's doing the recognition, yeah? It's something in your brain, or Barkley would say in your mind. And in the second case, you're seeing a bunch of other squiggles. And once again, the eye is not doing the work to know whether it's a word or not. That depends on your higher functions, right? The eye is just gating that information. Same thing when you hear a noise. Let's say there's an instrument being played by your next door neighbor, and your ear is hearing, maybe the music's too loud. So your ear is hearing acoustic vibrations, but your ear doesn't know whether it's a trumpet or a violin or a piano or drums. Your ear isn't doing that work. Your ear is just picking up the acoustic vibrations that impinge on it. And again, it's sending that information to a different part of your brain, in this case, the auditory cortex. And it would be your brain or your mind that would be telling you, oh, yes, that's a trumpet, that's a violin, right? That's a keyboard, that's a drum or whatever. But the ear isn't doing that, right? So what Barkley is saying is that the senses are just conveying basic information, but they're not making any judgments about what that information really is or what it means. Are we clear?
Yes.
Okay, so let me go back to the text. And so the same is true of all the senses. The senses take in information, but they don't make any judgments about what is that information. They're sending it in. And then later on, there's something else going on that makes those judgments. That's the important thing in this part of the text. So let's go back. Okay, so immediate perceptions are the things the senses pick up and send, and the mediate perceptions, without the I am in front, those are the things that tell us what the meaning is of the immediate perceptions. We interpret, in other words, the immediate perceptions, and that's the next step, which is called mediate. Okay, so the basic point here is that by sensible things, we mean only immediately sensible, right? Sensible things are those which can be perceived immediately by sense. And they agree, right? They agree on this. It's very important. It's very important. Okay? So when we sense things, we don't necessarily know their causes, for example. It's not the job of the senses to know how these things arise. They simply take in the information. Right? So very important that he establishes this, and we'll see why shortly. So just to head off any more questions, Hylus says he's conceding this point. He sees no problem with it. I tell you once and for all that by sensible things, I mean only things that are perceived by sense, and that the senses perceive only what they perceive immediately. That's fine with Hylus, the materialist, because they don't make inferences. An inference is a judgment, yes, or a conclusion that we draw. The senses don't do that work. And they agree there. It's a very important point of agreement. So Philonus recapitulates, we agree then that sensible things include only things that are immediately perceived by sense. This is a recapitulation of what Hylus has already conceded. Now tell me whether we immediately perceive by sight anything besides light, colors, and shapes, by hearing anything but sounds, by the palate anything besides tastes, by the sense of smell anything besides odors, and by touch anything more than tangible qualities. Well, of course we don't. Those are exactly the things that our senses perceive immediately. And Hylus says that that's right. That's the only thing that we perceive with the senses, the only things rather. So it seems, now here's the first big dent in Hylus's ontology of materialism. Philonus says, so it seems that if you take away all sensible qualities, there's nothing left that is sensible. Well, it's sort of obvious to say that, right? If you take away all the sensible qualities from something, then there's nothing left that can be sensed. And of course he has to agree. So for example, if I say to you, I'm holding something in my hand, right? Here's my hand. I have my hand closed around an object, and I'm holding something in my hand. And I say to you that what I am holding in my hand has no color or shape. It makes no sound. It has no taste. It has no odor. And it has no tangible qualities, meaning you can't even feel it. So in other words, I'm holding something in my hand that cannot be detected by any of the five senses. So what could I possibly be holding? If I'm holding something that cannot be detected by any of the five senses, what am I holding?
Nothing.
Nothing. Good for you. Exactly, nothing. The only way you would know if I were holding something is if it could be sensed, right? Then you would say, oh yeah, I see this, I hear this, I feel this, I taste this, or I touch this, of course. So if you take away all the sensible qualities from a supposed object, then there is no object as far as we know. Now, I hope you begin to see where he's headed, okay? Because he's going to tell us the whole world is like this. This is already now doing a huge amount of damage to Hylus's belief that things exist externally without anybody to perceive them. Suppose I ask you a question. I'm going to ask you all. Is the Empire State Building still standing this morning?
Yes.
Yes?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, you think so. You're all being very careful now. You've had a week of philosophy, so you know every question is loaded, and you're being cautious. You're saying, "I think so." Good for you. Okay, I like it that you are now becoming more reflective. You know that simple answers are not always simple, or not always the ones that hold up. Okay, you said you think the Empire State Building is still standing. Let me ask you then, what makes you believe that it's still there?
Because I mean, I haven't heard any news saying that the Empire State Building has been, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I
demolished.
can't quite hear you. It's not very clear what you're saying.
So I haven't heard any news.
Right,
saying that
bingo,
the
very good.
Empire
That's a great answer. You haven't heard that it's not there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Ah, so you had to hear something in order to, okay, now how do you know it was there the last time then?
Because the last time,
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead.
yeah, the last time we talked, there was news about it was like, the last, like a year ago or something, when and during a celebration, they light up the Empire State Building sort of accordingly. And
Yes.
you can still see.
So in other words, you could see it lit up, right?
Yes. Like
So it's there because you could see it.
Yeah. Like there's a contemporary record, a visual contemporary record, I guess.
Yes. So you're sensing it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it exists because you're able to sense it.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Barkley is. That's what Philonus is trying to lead Hylus to understand, that the only way we know anything exists is if we can sense it.
Well, actually, Professor, I might be sort of diving off, but this is actually interesting because one of the things in my home country in Egypt, we have like this funny joke about how someone stole the pyramids by basically, he somehow stole it by making it not be sensed by anybody. Like there's this weird like old stale about it. So is that the idea? Is the idea of like if you can't sense something, does it ever really exist?
That's right. That's exactly what Barkley is saying. I mean, it applies to the pyramids as well as the Empire State Building. If I ask you, are the pyramids still there? You would tell me, well, you haven't heard that they've been,
Removed.
made to disappear, right? They haven't been removed.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you hear, right?
Mhm.
The last time I was in Cairo, I visited Giza and I saw the pyramids. So I said, well, I know the pyramids exist because I saw them, and I touched them.
Right.
Or I could look at pictures of them, and so forth. So their existence depends on their being perceived. If nobody perceived the pyramids at all, if for some reason, right, nobody could perceive the pyramids at all in any way, shape, or form, then people would say they don't exist.
Right.
So existence depends on perception.
And the senses, which is
Well, that's what
this.
perception is. That's the immediate perception is exactly what the senses are doing. They're perceiving immediately. So for us to know that something exists, we have to be able to perceive it immediately. That's Philonus's whole point. That's Barkley, okay?
Mhm.
I have a
Of course, Descartes
question.
will disagree. Yes, you have a question, please.
Okay, so you're saying for something to exist, or at least what he's saying is that for something to exist, it has to be perceived. What if I'm the only person perceiving it?
I'm sorry, I
Like,
didn't
let's say-
catch the question. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so what if I'm the only person perceiving something? Like, let's say, I don't know, I see a ball fall and I'm the only one that saw it.
Well, if
Is-
you're the only one who sees something, then it exists for you.
Right, okay.
Okay, so if I'm not seeing it, how does this exist for me? Well, it could exist for me if you tell me you're seeing it, then I'm hearing about it.
Okay.
So you went somewhere for the weekend and I didn't, and you come back and you tell your friends where you were on the weekend. You were in some place they've never been, and now it exists for them. How? Because they've heard about it.
Oh, okay.
Right? But it's always one sense or another. Notice, you might be able to experience something through all five senses at once. If you go into a restaurant, you'd be able to see the food. I don't know if you can hear the food. Maybe when you cut it and chew it, okay, you can hear it. You can certainly taste it, touch it, and smell it. So you could experience a meal with all five senses. We don't always have to experience everything with all five senses, correct? What Barkley is saying in the mouth of Philonus is that as long as one of your senses at least is perceiving something immediately, then for you, that thing exists. Its existence depends upon being perceived by one or more senses. Clear?
Wait,
Yes.
I get that. Wait, hold on. I get that, but like, if just because my senses didn't get to experience that, and it doesn't exist for me, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all, right?
Well, excuse me. If nobody whatsoever is perceiving it, then how could we possibly say it exists?
No, I mean, like for me only. If me personally, since I didn't experience it, so it doesn't exist for me. But
That's
that doesn't
correct.
mean.
But now take that notion and suppose that nobody in the world, suppose there's something that nobody in the world can perceive in any which way. How could anybody therefore say it exists?
Yeah, I get that. All right.
Okay. Now, Barkley's making you think. I like this. Barkley is going to stretch your minds. All right. Philonus is going to resist this every step of the way. Hylus is going to resist this because he's a materialist. He believes that there's stuff out there, regardless of whether there's anybody perceiving it or not. And I suspect that most of you, because it's very natural, are also taking this position of Hylus. Most of you have never thought about this before. So maybe you've always assumed, well, yeah, the Empire State Building's there, whether anybody's perceiving it or not. But then when you follow Philonus's line of argument, you will begin to realize that the only way that you know it's there is by sensing it one way or another. Somebody told you they just saw it, or you're looking out the window and you see it, or you see a picture of it on the news or whatever. But anyway, you are sensing it. The only way you know it exists is through one or more of your senses. And this is the very, on the one hand, obvious, but on the other hand, very subtle point that if nobody can sense anything, then nobody could say that that thing exists. And so all of reality depends on perception. That's where he's headed. So let's go to the next page and see how he actually demonstrates this to Hylus. Hylus doesn't like this one bit. but he's going to resist, and in the end, he's not going to be able to resist any longer because of the force of Philonus's argument. Some of you are beginning to get this already. Okay.
Okay, but
So,
I
yeah.
have another question. So
Okay.
let's say there's like a painting, and then the whole world stops existing, and we all at some point knew that there was a painting. Does that mean that once the person disappears, like everybody in the world disappears and nobody can perceive it, does that mean it stops existing as well, the painting?
Good question. That's a great question.
Like,
Who's
what
speaking?
would
Who's
you say?
speaking right now? I didn't catch your name.
Alejandra.
Okay. Anyway, listen, that's a great question. So, but you're going to have to wait for the answer. All right. You may not like the answer. He has an answer for this, of course, but we're not there yet. That answer comes later in the dialogue. Suppose, for example, that there's painting. Imagine a museum hanging that's full of paintings, right? So everyone's observing the paintings when the museum's open, so therefore the painting exists, right? That's the reasoning of Philonus. People are observing. What happens when the museum closes? Yeah? What happens when the museum closes and there's no one left to observe the paintings? Do they cease to exist? No. They continue to exist because there is another agent who is perceiving them all the time. And we'll come to that later, okay? But let's stay with the simpler case now. Hold that question, and we'll come to it in a little while. So, does the reality, Philonus is now asking this really good question about what we call reality. Does the reality of sensible things consist in being perceived, or is it something different? And of course, Hylus, being a materialist, as many of you are, and there's nothing wrong with that, but Hylus is all his life thought to exist as one thing and to be perceived as another, right? Like many of you still think, well, there's stuff out there. I mean, there's always been stuff out there, whether we're perceiving it or not, there has to be something out there. And Philonus says, wait a second, I'm talking only about sensible things. My question is, by the real existence of one of them, do you mean an existence exterior to the mind? And Hylus says, yes, I mean absolute real existence distinct from and having no relation to being perceived. So Hylus thinks that stuff can exist without being perceived. And Philonus all along is saying the only way we know that anything exists is by perceiving it. So actually, there can be no existence without perception. Of course, Hylus thinks that things can be out there without anybody perceiving them. So the strategy that Philonus is going to follow, and I'll just give you this roadmap to the dialogue very quickly, and then we'll look at some examples. The roadmap is as follows. In this period of time, philosophers talked about the properties of things. Again, we're talking about sensible things, and they have properties which can be sensed. So, for example, a banana would be a certain shape, yes, and it would have, depending on its state of ripeness, if it was green, you would know it's probably not edible. If it's yellow, it's ripe to eat. If it gets speckled and brown, you know it's good for banana bread, probably, you know, too ripe to eat without being cooked. So bananas have different properties. You know, they may be very firm when they're green and very soft when they ripen. So all these different properties, they also smell different, right? So these properties of color, of odor, of you know, the tactile, the feeling of it when we touch it, these things are all called the properties of objects. And philosophers distinguish between primary and secondary properties. And primary properties were thought to be more intrinsic to the object themselves, the kinds of things Descartes discussed about physical world extension, you know, like occupying space, and things like its density, its mass, its velocity. These are all thought to be primary properties. The so-called secondary properties of things were like color, odor, taste. These were deemed to be secondary properties, but they were all thought to be properties of the thing. And what Philonus is going to do step by step is to demonstrate irrefutably to Hylus that these so-called properties of things are not in the things at all, but they're in our perceptions of the things only. And that the so-called properties that we attribute to things are actually only things that we ourselves sense. And that different kinds of perceptions would sense different properties. And that means the properties can't possibly belong to the things themselves. And so therefore, if you take what Hylus would call an independently existing thing, and you strip it of all its properties, it could no longer have anything left to support its existence. And so that again is going to be Philonus's point, that existence depends entirely on perception. Okay, so that is a very, very interesting route. And this is the most sober Scythe session I've ever had. What does this mean? Could you decode this for me, please? Okay, a vibe. All right, well, you're all sensing some kind of a vibe, so it must exist. That's what Philonus would say. Let's continue. I just wanted to give you the roadmap to how he does this. If I say I'm holding an object, and if I'm able to show that every property of that object is actually in my perceptions and not in the object itself, then the existence of that object will obviously depend totally on perception and on nothing else, okay? And that will refute this proposition by Hylus that existence is one thing and perception is another. Philonus is going to say, no, existence is only perception and nothing else. Okay, again, I'm repeating this so you'll understand where he's going, because it is certainly counterintuitive to most people. All right, so let's continue with the next page, and you're going to see exactly what he means by example. We're going to give you a very clear couple of examples of these so-called properties of things. And one of them has to do with heat. Okay, so here's the screen. Let me share it with you. Back to this example of heat. Generally speaking, I'm sure most of you are in the very commonsensical habit of saying stuff like the fire is hot, right? Like fire is hot and ice is cold, correct?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, that's common sense, you know? That's common sense. I'm not going to challenge it. It's common sense. But what Barkley is going to do through Philonus is convince Hylus that, in fact, the fire is not hot at all and ice is not cold at all. It really depends on our perceptions of heat and cold. There's nothing called heat or cold in the actual thing. It all has to do with our perceptions. And here's a thought experiment. You could try this at home. This is safe. He says, let's take 2 bowls of water, okay? Take 2 bowls of water and just put them on the counter in the kitchen and let them, you know, stand at room temperature, right? You know that the 2 bowls of water are at room temperature, and you know that they're at the same temperature. You could stick a thermometer in there to measure it. It would be room temperature. Now put one hand under hot water for a minute and put the other hand in the fridge or the freezer for a minute. So you're heating up one hand, you're cooling down the other, right? Now you take those 2 hands, one of them's been heated up a little bit and the other one's been cooled down a little bit. You take those 2 hands and you stick them in those 2 bowls of water that are, you know, at the same temperature, yes? Now, how is that water going to feel to the hand that's been heated up?
Oh, cool.
Cool, right? Exactly. And how is that water going to feel to the hand that's been stuck in the freezer for a minute?
Well,
warm, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's his point. You know that both bowls of water are the same temperature, and yet one feels warm and the other feels cool, right? So is the coolness and the warmth in the water, or is it in your perceptions? Yeah, you get it, right? It's in your perceptions. Yes.
Yeah, it's the perception.
Yeah, so then now I like it. Now you're seeing something you didn't see before, you didn't think about. It's in our perceptions. When we say the water's cold, what we really mean is the water feels cold to me.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, yeah, no, you know what? That makes sense too, because like, for instance, when you're outside in the cold, after a while, if you come in and like you touch something that's like regular temperature, right? You might feel that it's warmer, even though it's only your arm.
That's right. Exactly right. And also the converse of that, if you're in a really hot day like New York summer and you come into an air-conditioned place where the air conditioning is blasting, it's going to feel really cool, right? When you first step in. But then after a while, you get used to the air conditioning, yeah? And it doesn't feel that cold anymore until you step outside, and then it feels really hot again. So this feeling of heat and cold are in our perceptions. They're not in the things themselves. So you guys are still talking about hallucinogenic drugs. I don't know where that's coming from. THC, DMT, all of this. So I'm missing all this conversation, but I'm getting back to the dialogue. Okay. So please stay with the dialogue. So that means that heat and cold are not in the things themselves, so-called things. They're in our perceptions. And the same is true if you don't want to reach into the oven and take out something that's been baking, because you'll burn your fingers, right? But if you put on an oven mitt and you stick your hand in the oven and pull out something that's been baking, you don't feel heat, right? Because you don't feel it. You really don't know that this thing is hot. Do you know that some people don't feel pain? I mean, there's a neurological condition whereby people's nerve endings aren't working properly and they're not conveying pain. So it's very dangerous, because if you accidentally put your hand on a hot stove, don't do this at home, but if you accidentally put your hand on a hot stove, you're just going to basically, there's a reflex that will retract it even before you feel anything. There's immediately, you're going to retract your hand, knowing that you're about to burn it, or you already have. But if people don't feel pain, then they don't feel heat, and they don't know that their hand is burning. So the heat is not in the thing, it's in our sensation. And this is going to go through this. Now use this for all the other, because he's going to make the same argument with all the other senses. That this is true of our sense of touch, of sensation, then it's going to be equally true of every other sense. And he does. Same thing with taste. And we'll go to this page. So you'll see exactly the same point being made now with the sense of taste. For example, the sense of taste, right? Is sweetness in the sugar? Well, no. By the same argument, sweetness is on our tongue. Yes, we have actually only 4 tastes. You know this, yes? Some of you have studied this. You know that what we call taste is only really restricted to 4 different sensations. We have 4 kinds of taste buds on the tongue. And actually, when we experience extremely tasty things, most of that is actually smell. Odor is what triggers our much broader palate. When we, walk into a spice market and we're assailed by all these very beautiful and exotic scents of all the spices, none of those things are on our taste buds. That's all actually sense of smell. So we confuse the 2 senses. But of the 4 of tastes, yes, you know what they are, right? There's bitter, salty, sour, and sweet. Those are the only 4 tastes our tongue is capable of distinguishing. But once again, taste is on our tongues. Why is it that some people find the same dish too sweet and other people find it not sweet enough? Why is it some people will say this is too salty and other people will say it needs more salt? Because the notion of sweetness and saltiness is in our taste buds on our tongues and not in the recipe or not in the food itself. And that's why different people will experience the same dish, but will find it too sweet, too salty, or not sweet enough or not salty enough. That's obviously about the taste not being in the food. Yeah? Okay. And that, so what the argument that went through with the sense of heat and cold, our ability to sense things with our, tactility and sense of touch, this goes through with the sense of taste. And it also goes through with our sense of sight. So back to the next example, which is that one. Let me just go back to the text and turn the page. And we're going to get to this very important business about the colors of things. Let's say we look at a beautiful sunset, yeah? Beautiful sunset. What colors are in the clouds? Beautiful sunset. What kind of colors do you see?
Orange.
Yes, we do. Orange, and what else?
Yellow.
Yellow, we do. Yeah. Any others?
Red.
Reds. Yep. All of those. Orange, yellows, reds, purples. Yeah. We see amazing, beautiful colors. Yes.
Yeah.
And now suppose that you're watching a sunset and you see all these beautiful colors in the clouds. Suppose someone's flying through those clouds in an airplane. Maybe you have. Do you see all those colors when you look out the window?
No.
No? What color is a cloud normally?
Blue. Or
Well,
white. Oh, black.
Well, suppose you could stick your hand out the airplane and catch some of that cloud in a jar. Let's say you're flying an old biplane, so it's open to the air, and you're flying through a cloud, and you stick out a jar, and you literally catch some of the cloud in a jar, and and at sunset, and you take that jar back to the laboratory, and you take a look at it. What color is it?
Is it still white?
It's probably no color at all. It's just water vapor, yeah?
Oh, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, do the science. I think it's mostly water vapor. I'm not talking about pollution or smog. I'm talking about just clouds, right? So
Yeah.
the point is that clearly the point is the same once again, just with respect to a different sense, that the beautiful colors of the sunset that we see are not in the clouds, they're in our perceptions. Because if you're flying in the clouds, you don't see them. And if you catch some of that cloud and take it back to the lab, it's not retained any color at all. It never did. And now I'll tell you something more shocking. We used to say when we came home from school, our parents used to say, "What did you learn today?" Right? Like, what did you learn in school today? You're supposed to learn something every day. Now I'll tell you something shocking. Maybe they'll pull you out of college when you tell them you learned this today. I don't know. Okay, what color's the grass?
Green.
Yes, it looks green, right? I certainly agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. Most grass looks green to the eye, and there's a very good reason for it. And Barkley, of course, through Philonus, Hylus is going to say the grass is green. And Hylus, moreover, wants to say that greenness is a property of the grass. Yes, so there's this physical thing called grass, and greenness belongs to the grass. And Philonus is going to say, no, greenness belongs to our perception and nothing else. And modern science bears him out very, very exactly. Why? Because green things like grass are not green. They're actually every other color. What they're doing is they're absorbing light. You know this, plants photosynthesize, right? And they turn light into sugars and other energy sources. That's the process of photosynthesis, and the chlorophyll in these plants is the thing that absorbs the light and engages that process, right? So the reason why grass appears green to us is that wavelength around the green color of wavelength is that wavelength or that energy of light for which the plant has no use. It can't work with that frequency of light, so it reflects it. It absorbs the blue, it absorbs the yellow, it absorbs the red, it absorbs all the other visible frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call colors. It absorbs them because energetically it's able to use those wavelengths or those frequencies in its energy cycle. But green it doesn't use, so it reflects green. So actually, technically speaking, the grass is every color except green. If you're asking about what's in the grass has absorbed all the other wavelengths, but not the ones corresponding to the color green. So the grass isn't green at all. It's reflecting green to us. Hasn't absorbed any of it. So there's no green in the grass. There's only green in our perceptions. I hope some of you were shocked by this, okay?
Well, actually, Professor, wouldn't this be more refraction, since the idea is it's not absorbing the color?
Yes, you could say it's refracting them, but it's also reflecting them. And but in any case, the greenness is not in the grass.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, this is supporting Philonus's point of view, yeah? That what we call these properties of objects, whether it's sweetness or heat or colors or odors, these things are not in the object themselves, they're in our senses. And that takes care of all the so-called secondary properties. And now Hylus is admitting it because Philonus has thus far persuaded him. He can't keep this up any longer. You see that passage where Hylus says, I have to admit, Philonus, I can't keep this up any longer. Colors, sounds, tastes, in a word, all those so-called secondary qualities or secondary properties of objects have no existence outside the mind. Okay, that's so half the argument is won now, because Philonus has convinced him that those so-called secondary qualities do not exist outside the perceiving mind. They're not in the objects at all. They're in the perceiving mind. But Hylus will draw a line now, and the next thing is he says, yeah, but the real primary stuff is still in the objects, yeah? So the so-called primary qualities that they talks about, extendedness, that means length or area or volume. Shape means shape, whether it's, round or square or triangular, some other shape. Solidity, by that they meant density, mass per unit volume. Gravity, they meant weight. Motion, whether something's moving or at rest, if it's not moving. Those are the so-called primary properties. And these things, Hylus says, really exist in the objects, yeah? So you know what's going to happen next, right? You've already seen enough of this dialogue, and hopefully you've read ahead. You know that now, the second part of this first dialogue, Philonus is going to convince Hylus that those so-called primary properties or primary qualities, they only exist in our perceptions too. They only exist in our perceptions too. So, and I'm going to go over that with my group on Thursday, and hopefully you'll go over the primary properties and their existence only in the senses, you know, with your breakout groups. But let's skip to the end momentarily. Let's pretend we did all that work. And then we were able to show, as Philonus is showing Hylus, that if you take away from these objects, supposedly existing objects, if you remove all of the so-called secondary qualities and show that they exist only in our perceptions and not in the objects, and then you take away all the so-called primary qualities, which he will do in the next pages, and show that they exist not in the objects but only in our senses, then clearly there's nothing left, right? There is nothing left, only our perceptions. So there cannot be anything out there that exists independently of our perceptions. And that's exactly Barkley's point in the mouth of Philonus, that to exist is to be perceived, okay? And that's where the argument is going. So in the remaining time, I want to go back to this original question that somebody asked, and we'll just cut to the chase. Remember I mentioned to you that Barkley had an ulterior motive for writing these dialogues? Do you remember this? I think I said this at the beginning, right? Okay, pretty sure I did. And well, yes, Descartes is a dualist, and the second thing is the existence of extended things, so-called extended things. He distinguishes between thinking things and extended things, yes? Mental phenomena and physical phenomena. So it's mind and body, okay? Mental stuff and physical stuff. That's Descartes' other thing. And here, by contrast, Barkley is saying there's only mental stuff, because ultimately the immediate perceptions that we have, remember the senses give us immediate perceptions, and then we interpret those. And we form ideas about what the senses are telling us. And the bottom line is that all of these things that we say exist are just ideas in our minds. There's nothing else. The whole world is just a world of ideas that we have that comes to us from the ideas are being stimulated by the information that we get from the senses, which perceive immediately. And our immediate perceptions are the interpretations of that information. Our immediate perceptions are only ideas, and there's absolutely nothing physical in the world. It's all made of ideas. So that's the conclusion of the argument. We're not there yet. He still has to go through the primary qualities, yes, and show how they are also just dependent upon perception. But what I wanted to say to you is just the answer to this other question, which came up much earlier on. What if a bunch of paintings are hanging in a museum and everyone's in there looking at them, so they exist, right? Because they're being perceived. What happens when the museum closes and there's nobody in there? Do the paintings still exist or not?
Yes, so yes.
Okay, well, Barkley would say they do, but they have to be perceived in order to exist. So who's perceiving them?
God?
Yes, exactly, God. That's a very good answer. That's Barkley's answer. So here's the deal. Suppose you live alone, right? Suppose you're alone in the house, right? So what happens when you go to sleep? Are you perceiving yourself?
I would assume no.
No, you're not perceiving.
Sometimes.
If you're sound asleep, you know, for the sake of argument, you're not dreaming, okay? You're in deep sleep. So there's nobody else there, not even a dog or a goldfish. So no, you're not being perceived, okay? You're not being perceived. So what, do you stop existing? That would be crazy, right? To suppose you stop existing when you stop perceiving yourself and then you start re-existing next morning when you wake up. That's pretty far-fetched. So Barkley's not going there. If we believe that something exists, to state it most generally, if we believe that something exists continuously, then according to Barkley's ontology, since to exist is to be perceived, continuous existence implies continuous perception. Yes? So something has to be perceiving continuously in order for anything to exist continuously. And since we can't do that, then it must be God that's doing that. That's how come he would account for the existence of the world. If we say, look, the world existed before life, this planet is older than life, yes? Life emerged on the planet or was created on the planet or came to the planet, whatever you believe the origin of life is. We geologically, we suppose this planet was busy coalescing and cooling down for a long, long time before it was possible for life to exist, right? So how did this planet exist if no one was there to perceive it? How did the universe exist if no one was there to perceive it? Barkley's answer is that this is what God does, that God perceives everything continuously, and so that's why everything exists continuously. And that's the ulterior motive he has. Some of you may like this explanation, and some of you may not. But Barkley, that's part of Barkley's ulterior motive for writing the dialogue. It doesn't detract from the validity of his argument, because his argument is very powerful. The argument that existence is only perception and that there's no such thing as material substance in the world is a very powerful argument. If you see to the bottom of it, it's amazing that what we feel is solid only feels that way because we're feeling it. In fact, we know that solid objects are mostly empty space, right? If solid objects are made of molecules and atoms, it's mostly empty space. How can they support coffee cups? How can the table support a coffee cup? It's a great mystery. But what feels solid to us is not at all solid in reality. It's only a perception. And there's much more out there than we can sense. But perception, if it's continuous, is God's work. So the ulterior motive is as follows. Berkeley was deeply concerned as an observer of society, and he was also a bishop in Ireland. He was deeply concerned because basically he saw that the culture was becoming more materialistic, and it was because of the Industrial Revolution primarily that was unfolding in the 18th century. And he saw that people were becoming very materialistic and not as spiritual as they used to be. And he thought this might be a bad thing for society. Actually, that it was not entirely spiritually healthy for people to become over-focused on materialism. And you could make that argument today, right? I mean, there's a lot we could say about that. But materialistic cultures aren't necessarily happy, and many would say, including Barkley, that's because they're concentrating too much on material and not enough on the spiritual. So in any case, what Barkley wanted to do was to debunk the whole idea of materialism and reintroduce God into the equation to remind people that the Industrial Revolution was not the answer to all the questions in the universe, and also to kind of wean them away from an overly materialistic point of view. So Hylus in this dialogue is playing the role of a kind of hardcore materialist, and Barkley is playing the role of someone, a philosopher, who wants to remind him that existence depends on perception, and that there's no such thing as existence independent of perception. So you guys have had to work very hard this morning. Some of you are saying your brain is working overtime. That's a good thing, right? Philosophy is like gymnastics for the mind, right? If you want to train hard, if you want to do well in a sport, you have to train hard and push your body. I've said this before, and the analogy goes through. If you want to do well in philosophy or in any subject in the university, you also have to do some work to put your mind through some exercises that may be strenuous, but in the end will pay dividends for you because you'll end up being in better shape as a result. Okay, so good work this morning digesting this pretty esoteric sounding dialogue at first, but I hope you begin to see what Barkley's really driving at, that existence depends on perception. Okay, anyway, I'm glad you guys are thinking. Any comments or questions before we wrap this up?
Yeah, Professor, the main comment is, how does Berkeley contend then with specifically what Descartes talked about with the idea of, the failure of perception, right? Like, if your senses fail you, then how can you be sure that anything you perceive is true? And obviously, so, I'll finish up right now. I guess the big example would be like schizophrenia. How can people be true? Believe that everything that they perceive exists if there's literally a condition where your perception of a certain thing that exists is not real. It's
well, not real to anybody else. Again, we're back to this question of what reality consists of. You're asking several deep questions here. Let me be very brief. In answer to Descartes, it's really interesting contrast, and that's a great question, because Descartes is not entirely, Berkeley does not entirely disagree with Descartes, because in the end, for Berkeley, existence is mental, right? Because ultimately, our perceptions turn into ideas, and those things are really the only things that exist. So he is actually more radical than Descartes, because Descartes is convinced that ideas are real, and he's not so sure about the material substance because it's dubious, it comes through the senses. They differ exactly on this point also, because for Berkeley, the only valid perceptions we can have are through the senses. So now if you're going to ask what is the difference between reality and hallucination, neither of them can really be sure, and neither can we. If someone with bipolar disorders hears voices, then those voices are real to that person, are they not? And why are they real? Because they're hearing them. And we're not hearing them, so they're not real. That's exactly Berkeley's point. Existence is perception. If you hear something that nobody else hears, then it's real to you. Whereas if I don't hear it, it's not real to me. So therefore, the reality and the existence of things depends precisely upon their being perceived by a perceiver. This is just what Philonus has been arguing the whole time. And that's a very, very serious and interesting issue. It's not always a bad thing. I mean, it's a bad thing if you hear voices that tell you to do, go out and do heinous things. And there are people who need their medication because otherwise the voices will tell them to kill people. And this is what often happens, right? Unfortunately. But suppose you hear things that nobody else hears and turn them into symphonies. That would be a good thing, right? That means you're a composer. How do we get original music? Someone hears something that nobody else heard, right? And then they write it down and they record it, or someone else plays it, and then it becomes real to everybody else. But it always started by someone hearing something that nobody else heard. So that could be a good thing, right? It could be a good thing. It's not a hallucination. But in any case, it had to be perceived in order for it to exist. And I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot of really good questions coming up. And I urge you to consider with your instructors in your breakout groups, ask them these questions. We'll begin to explore some of the similarities between Barkley and Descartes, as well as the differences, fundamentally the ontological and epistemological differences, but they both believe in God at the end of the day. So that's a big similarity. In any case, I wish you a good day today. We're going to wrap it up. Have a good day and read the rest of the dialogue. He's going to convince Hylus, however reluctantly, that he has to realize primary qualities are in the perceptions too. There's nothing out there. There's only our perceptions. And on that happy note, I hope you enjoy your perceptions the rest of today. And I'll look forward to seeing you all next Monday. And I'll see my group on Thursday. You'll see your own instructors during your breakouts. Okay, have a great week, everybody. Stay well, stay safe. You're more than welcome.
Thank you.
Have a great week. I'll see you next Monday. Yeah, and we'll take up materialism. All right, bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
Have a good day.
So long.
Excuse me, Professor.
Bye-bye. Yes?
Professor, excuse me. May I know when you will post this video to the...
This video?
Yeah, sorry, this
sure.